So this is going to be our player class hierarchy. We have a game object, which is going to have these properties. We're going to have a player, which has these properties, and we're going to have a bullet, which has these. And we're going to tie them all together so that we're going to reuse all this code that we write here in the player. So the first thing I want to do is I want to kind of like take what we've been doing for the player and make a split so that we move over anything that we want to share from one class to another. So let's open up this guy here. I happen to have a lot of this stuff already made. So we're going to take position, velocity, and acceleration. And I'm doing this, and I'm going to give you guys this lab so you guys can all start with the same one. And for my member variables, these are going to be the 3 member variables that I have for my hierarchy. And in our engine, I want to make sure I include this guy here. So it's going to have position, velocity, and acceleration. So that's what these 3 are. And it's going to have a sprite and a texture, so I'm going to move those over as well. These 2 are both from the player. It's going to have an angle of rotation. That's what all our ships have. Okay. And it has some behavior here. Has drag, has a constructor. Okay. Has drag, screen edge to screen edge, and has the ability to get drawn on screen. Okay. So we know that those are functions that we applied earlier. So I'm going to take all these guys here. Oh, and limiting velocity as well. These are all things that I'm just moving from the player and converting them over to be in the game object instead. So they all have the ability to draw, update, apply drag. There's my constructor. There's drag, limiting velocity, screen edge to screen edge, draw on screen. And also, so this is going to represent our game object class. Okay. We're going to add the ability for game objects to also get destroyed, because it's a very common thing in games to be destroyed. Obviously, asteroids are going to get destroyed, but our bullets are also going to get destroyed. So I want to migrate all the stuff we did for the player into a CPP for this game object. And I already did all this earlier, but I'm going to go over this again for the CPP. So a few things. I'm going to include GameObjects.h. I'm also going to write the constructor first. And all it's going to do is the same thing the player does. Instead of it being a player, though, I'm going to call it a game object, because that's what our hierarchy is going to be. It's going to take a path to a texture and a position and initialize the position and then load the texture and assign it to the sprite. And then 2 other things I want to add are the ability for this thing to draw. So I have a draw function here, which comes from, again, what the player was doing. I have an update function, which we just went over, the solution for how to make it go from one side of the screen to another. So this is all the stuff for applying drag and accelerating and limiting velocity. All from the player. We're just renaming it from game object to from player to game object, applying drag and limiting velocity. And we're going to take all of these guys here. So there's our apply drag function, which we just wrote together with friction. I'm going to set the friction back to 1. Limiting velocity we did last week. This is how you actually make it clamp to a max speed. So everything in our game moves no faster than 500 pixels per second. Our angle, which we have here, which I need a couple functions here to set and get the angle to. Like so. Those are going to represent the way to get the rotation of the game object. And then a way to change the position of the game object too. I actually don't think we No, we do need this for the bullets. Let's add that later. Okay, so that was the last stuff, but all I really did was I renamed the game object in order to have it be a, what used to be the player is now considered a game object. And ultimately, if I go back here, I can still create a player, and the player is going to take a path to his texture. And let's make the path of the texture pick a ship here. This one seems good. I know that it's in sprites, PNG. There's my ship, and then I'm going to put it 200, 100 there. That's the path of the texture. Oh, right. Like this. Okay, and then here I'm going to do player.update. I think that's what I called it. I missed a semicolon somewhere.
Yeah, at the very bottom when you did draw.
Oh, this one here. And I'm going to do an update, and I'm going to do a draw. Same thing what we did with the player previously. And oh, one other thing is I forgot to put the public modifier on here. So this thing has to be public so that I can actually access the constructor. And then draw. And I have DT. And draw requires a render window. So it's the same thing as what we had before. Looks like I didn't load the texture. Oh, because I was right the first time here. These are escapes. I want this here. So there's my ship, and it doesn't rotate or anything like that yet because, again, this in our world is now not a player. It's just a game object. It's just another thing that has a position, and I can do things like I can have it have an acceleration. I can actually have it, it has the ability to have a position and velocity. So if I have the ability to set the velocity, I can add a function to say set velocity, like so. And this set velocity function for our game object allows us to control how fast it's moving. And all this thing is going to do is take the velocity and assign it this one. And even though our thing is just a game object, we can go ahead and set the velocity to be something like 200, 100. So it'll move to the right and up. Oh, sorry, to the right and down. Moving down. So it moves, but I'm not controlling it because, again, we talked about dividing our classes up, so only the player has the ability to move forward, and only the player has the ability to rotate. So move forward with the keyboard. So I could add behavior inside here, inside our update function, to detect whether I'm currently pressing the up key or not, but then everything would move. Everything that's derived off game object would move because that would be shared across our bullets as well. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write that function inside the player. And the place that I'm going to write that in is going to be the overridden version of update. So I'm going to write inside my own update function the ability to move forward. So here's update, and I'm going to make this thing public as well. And I'm going to implement this function in the CPP, like so. However, this is not going to be for the game object now. This is going to be for the player. So the player has an update function. And all I want to do is if the keyboard has the up key pressed, I'm going to take my acceleration and I'm going to set it equal to some number. And there's a function that I'm going to actually grab, which is the set acceleration function here, which takes an amount from the player. This is the same function we had on the player before. And I'm going to add that to the game object too. Because even though the player is the one that's actually accelerating, I want the game object to also have the ability to accelerate based on the rotation that it's facing. I need this defined at the top. You guys remember this defined, converting degrees to radians? With this number here. Okay, so now my game object has a function called setAcceleration, and all I have to do is call it here, inside the player. So as long as I have a player object, I can press up. But this thing that I have moving on screen isn't a player, it's a game object. So if I want to actually have it be a player, I do that. Now, here's the interesting part about having this thing be a player. We haven't given a constructor for the player that takes these two arguments. That constructor only lives inside the game object. So if we want to actually have people who create the player be able to specify a texture, we have to recopy this constructor. But here's a trick. Maybe I don't want the player to have to specify a path. Maybe all I want to do is specify, hey, give me a position. So look at how these two constructors are different. I'm going to copy them next to one another here. This is the constructor for the player. This is the constructor for the game object. I'm leaving out the texture. And here's what I can do by leaving out the texture. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to implement the constructor. Same way I implemented the game object constructor. And what I actually want to do is the player is going to call the constructor for the game object. One of the only times that you can actually have the constructor call another constructor is in this specific case. I am writing the constructor for a derived class. I can call the constructor for the base class by putting a colon, just like you would initialize a variable. And I call the constructor like this. Right in the same line. This is the only spot you can do this. I cannot move this line here. That doesn't work. But I'm going to call this constructor, and what I'm going to pass into here is going to be the path to the ship I want. Like so. And I'm going to also pass in the position of the player. So this is kind of a funky syntax, right? My player constructor is calling the game object constructor, and the game object constructor takes two arguments. One is the path to the texture here. The second is where does that game object live? Because these two arguments are the two arguments that you are needed to pass into the constructor up here. Like so. What this means, though, is that now anytime I make a player, I don't have to specify a path to the texture. I'm already telling the game what that texture is right here. And so now when I make a player, though, after I make the player public, I need this constructor to be public. So inside my engine, I have a player now, and I'm setting his velocity. But I can actually, if I go in here, let's make sure we're doing this. Oh, one other thing this is actually really good. So I have my player, and I'm pushing up. And one thing, he's not even in the right position, and he's not moving up at all. And I'm telling it to set the acceleration here. This is definitely getting called. Like if I put a breakpoint in here, if I put a breakpoint in here, oh, can't actually go into there. Let's do it in debug. So this is definitely getting called, And I can even put a breakpoint inside here, so when I press the up key, I know it's setting the acceleration. So why is the ship not moving? I have this function here, it's calling update. This is a derived class off of GameObject. Doesn't it inherit all the behavior of the GameObject that it derives from? Well, it definitely has all the member variables, and we're definitely overriding the function. However, by default, it's not going to call the GameObject version of update. Just because I have my own version, what I'm actually telling it is, hey, this is all I want my update function to do. Explicitly, if I deleted this and left this empty, my player essentially has nothing that it does in update. Even though it's derived from GameObject, and look at my update for my GameObject, look at all this stuff that I'm doing here. I want it to call all of this stuff too. So how do I have it call all this stuff? Well, I could copy all this code from the update, and I could paste it right here. But this is actually the wrong way. Like this is not, we don't want to be copying and pasting code. So how do I have this thing call the GameObject update? Like this. Just like that. This is really weird because you haven't really seen this syntax before, right? Like calling this. So what this is actually saying is that, hey, I'm a player, I'm derived from GameObject, but in my function here, what I want you to do is I want you to do whatever GameObject does. And this, what it actually will do, let me show you what actually happens here. I'll undo all my changes here. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to run this. I'm going to put a breakpoint right there. And what it's going to do is when I step into here, it's going to jump into the GameObject update function, do all of this code, which is to update the position and check to see if you are currently out of bounds. Then come back and then run my code on top of it. I'm using all the stuff I wrote before, and I'm just adding a little bit of a difference. So now if I press up, I accelerate up. Okay. Oh, the drag? Yeah, you know, I'm also not clearing the acceleration if I'm not pressing that. So if I'm not pressing a key, I need to make sure my acceleration is set down to 0 again, because what's actually happening is that I'm pressing up. It's actually holding, it was actually constantly accelerating. So here's the key. If you want to ever remove behavior from a parent class, like let's say I want to change how one of these functions works, all you have to do is not call it in your version. Like if I just left this empty, now my player just doesn't do anything in the update. Okay? All right. So one last thing I want to do is I want to add the rotation back in for our player. And I'm going to do that right here because the player is the only one that can rotate. So if the keyboard is pressed, I actually have this code written already. So I'm just going to copy it. Then I'll give you guys a break. We can come back. Let's see, I thought I had this written here. Maybe. Okay, I'll just write it again. Your keyboard. So we can put all the rotation behavior right here as well inside the player. So that now I can turn around and around. And if I ever don't want to have rotation behavior, I can just remove this. So what's the difference here? Well, I have my player here, and remember, he can also just be a game object instead of a player, which would then remove all the behavior that I put in for turning and moving. So if I just have this thing be a game object, it's very different from having him be a player. A game object will just sit there, and I can't move or rotate, right? And the only difference is I'm creating a different type of variable here. They both behave the same, except for the fact that the player has just one function inside here in the update that handles up movement, left and right movement too. So we'll get the.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So now that we have this for the player, we're going to use the same exact principle to author a bullet. So a bullet behaves very similarly to a game object. The only difference is that a bullet is going to fly through the air and then die after some period of time, right? In order to get to the bullet, though, I need to talk about another concept, which I'll get to after the break, which is we're going to have a way to manage lots and lots of objects in our game. Just like in here, in this case, bullets are getting created and destroyed dynamically. Like I have a lot of bullets on screen, and if I sit for some time, eventually they get cleaned up. So we're going to add another concept of an array of game objects, and that array of game objects is going to be managed by another class. So we're going to talk about that after break, and so I'll give you guys some time, and then come back and we'll do bullets, and then I'll give you guys the lab. All right?